Hello and welcome everyone to this panel on the Battle of Memes in Russia's war on Ukraine. I'm Kristian Bjørkelo. I am an assistant professor at LLE at the University of Bergen. I have a PhD in media studies, and I'm also a folklorist, which we'll come back to soon. With me, I have a wonderful panel, which I'm going to let speak soon. First of all, we have Liliia Oprysk, who's an associate professor at the Faculty of Law. Your main focus is on copyright law, right? And we have Johanne Kalsaas. You are a PhD fellow in Russian media and communication studies at the University of Bergen. And you focus on online commentary and user-generated content. Am I right?
Yes.
Excellent. And then lastly, we have Eva Johais, who is a postdoc at the Institute here, and her research focuses on war as experience in different types of intervention, and including politics of state building, electoral assistance, and humanitarian aid. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all your perspectives on memes. So we'll start with you, Liliia.
Yes, thank you. So my name is Liliia, and what was not mentioned yet, I'm Ukrainian. So if we could have slides, please. So what I would like to start with, that today is day 399 of this Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and over 9 years of this war going on. And you know, just a year ago, Russian troops were retracting from Kiev, so we saw this all atrocities on the internet. And this has been, of course, a part of every Ukrainian's life for this year. But what I would like to talk about today, and we will talk in this panel, is about memes, because they also became a very important part of Ukraine's culture and resistance. And memes are used not only to fight disinformation in this war and propaganda, as we will be discussing, but they are also used by Ukrainians to kind of deal with what are we going through. So I hope in my presentation to actually show you different functions memes can have for society such as Ukrainian. So what I will showcase you today are some memes. They are mostly in Ukrainian, and I think it is very special because those would be accessible only to those who speak the language. And you know, Ukrainian is different language than Russian, and those would be accessible to those having some cultural background. So I think it's also important to look at Ukrainian memes and not only English or Russian, because there are of course more of those. And those are being mostly actually spread on Twitter or on Facebook. So let's start. And I have to start with a meme from around 10 days before the start of the full-scale invasion. I shared it with my husband. I thought it was very funny. I don't think it's so funny anymore looking back at it today. But you know, in history books, you read about false flag operations, about provocations as a start of a military attack. But here we were sitting, you know, and just reading, okay, full-scale attack likely in 2, 10, 4 days. So we're just hoping we are not doomed, you know. But the history proved us a bit wrong. But we are not doomed, you know. And since the first day of the war, humor was actually very important to uphold faith in that we can actually withstand the attack, and making fun of something which is maybe not funny to people outside. So this is a meme. It's actually still in English. You know, us standing against the aggressor, but of course getting help from all the countries around us. Or for example, here, this is already starting with Ukrainian memes, our military unit when we get uniforms from different volunteers. So, you know, people are looking differently at the very beginning. This has, of course, changed. It became better. But of course, we used memes to also express our despair. Here is a cat saying, "Put all four on, I don't care anymore." And you have to know that in Ukraine, most of the stoves are gas ones. So, you know, if you put this on, you will get flames. So there was a way to actually express despair. But you can also express through memes a confidence. That is a very recent one, actually, showing on the left us on 21st of February last year and us on 21st of February this year, much more confident. I would say. I also would like to show some memes that reflect on current political situation. Here you can see very jealous Boris Johnson because the Macron was traveling to Kiev. And even more funny, I found this one that is during Biden's visit to Kiev. And you know, Ukrainians on Twitter, they call Biden grandpa. so here Biden is kind of acting in exactly the same way Ukrainian grandpa would do with his grandchild, basically giving some money and saying, here, get yourself that PlayStation. But also memes are used to actually comment on things which are not working that well in Ukraine, you know, because that's our reality as well. So here you can see like a table. It shows when your house will get electricity, you know, on particular day and time. Because of the Russian drone attacks, you know, people stay without electricity for days. And it says everywhere, as good wishes, because it is not very reliable. So that is a way to make fun of that too. And kind of an opposite, there is a meme showing, you know, when you had electricity for the 5th day in a row, what do you do with all this treasure? You know? So people are actually getting used to having electricity again. And not even our president is actually spared. So on the left, you can see President being, you know, respectfully referred to Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zelensky in Bakhmut when he is on the front line. On the right side, that is nickname Zalupa, when he signed some controversial law that Ukrainians are not happy with. You know, both sides represented. However, very importantly, only Ukrainians are entitled to call Zelensky names. So here's Lukashenko, you know, offending our president. We are not happy with that. We can do it ourselves, no worries. But we of course realize that our ability to make these memes and to make fun of the situation is also, or not also, but the primary reason for that is our armed forces. So here's, for instance, using a very touching picture from the Zelensky interview where when he was referring to his wife, was made into a meme. So every Ukrainian talking about the armed forces of Ukraine. This is my love, my best friend, my energy. And in turn, also Ukrainian defense expresses gratitude to international partners, and not least the NAFO, North Atlantic Fellow Organization, that we'll be talking later in this panel. And on the right, this is my own NAFO fellow, which I also proudly have on my t-shirt. And it just had to include a cat, you know. And I like to end with this one, perfectly demonstrating, you know, the ups and downs during this year, as well as the attitude. Anyway, glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to give a short introduction to some of the terminology we're going to use here today, like memes and memetic warfare. So if I can have my slides here. Yes, thank you. So I've been given the task of kind of untangling or disentangling different strands of meanings of memes. And as you see, this is very humorous stuff, right? So trying to make sense of the nonsense of internet humor in these very serious times. So by disentangling the different understandings of memes, we also disentangle different ways of understanding memetic warfare, I hope. So we're starting out with the concept of memes. It originates with Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, from 1976. So it's an old book, and he discusses this as in the sense of as genes, but cultural genes, right? That is transmitted through, not through procreation or through generations, but socially, through culture. These are ideas that are spread in our society, and they kind of stick, and they adapt and stay around. And to me, as a folklorist, I recognize this as something else. I recognize this as folklore, right? Stories, ideas, traditions that are transmitted, disseminated socially and culturally, and originally also through generations, like stories, legends, fairy tales, jokes. Humor is very important in folklore. So we see these instantly. We see this connection with memes and folklore, and it becomes very much evident when we discuss the other form of memes that we are more familiar with, which is the internet meme. Right? This is the more colloquial understanding of memes. When we discuss memes among ourselves, we usually talk about these internet memes and jokes spread online. They are often visual jokes and what we used to refer to as macros, which is a picture that is standardized and different text to that juxtaposed where that image gives a humorous effect. Right? And my favorite would always be the different lol cats, right? Which is old. I'm old, right? But lol cats are fun, right? It is good pictures of cats and nonsensical text in a very specific language or structure of language that is also known as lol speech, right? These are kind of the original classic macros and visual memes. But they express trends and ideas. They are transmitted socially and culturally at a breakneck speed. It's happening very fast, right? So it's no longer through generations that we spread our culture. It is from day to day, and it's constantly adapting to different situations. So the meme with Mr. Bean standing and waiting for the war, it has been used in different situations where people have been waiting for something that isn't coming. So it adapts to trends and our current situations. These jokes and these memes are often considered edgy. They can be provocative, transgressive, even offensive, right? So that's part of it. And we often consider, because of that, we often consider that part of youth culture. But as most of us here are not part of youth culture per se, we could probably protest there and we say, we partake in memes as well as the kids today. So that's the internet meme. So you have, on the one hand, the memes and the memetics of documents, which is like a broad idea of how ideas spread in our culture socially. We also have this narrow, more contemporary and colloquial understanding of memes as mostly funny stuff online, right? Whether it's these kind of picture gags or it's viral TikTok videos, these are spreading rapidly and carrying important ideas, I think. So that means that these things will also become our expressions of situations in war, like folklore always has, right? So folklore has been used both to create diversity and conflict, as well as mitigating it and making it easier to handle conflict and suffering. It makes it easier to handle anxiety because we can joke about it and we can tell stories about it, how it all turns out well. They can become acts of resistance where we show that we do not agree with what's going on here. We have a joke to tell in response. It can be a subversion, right? It can be telling a story that subverts the official narrative and saying, this is our story now. And it also works as a disciplining factor, making people know what they're supposed to believe and what they're supposed to think. So we see these things happening in wartime, and these times now we see it with memes, right? In the war in Ukraine. So this brings us to the kind of the memetic warfare. So we see here that memes serves to win our hearts and minds. They become a propagandic tool. We saw this with the war against ISIS, where ISIS were using a lot of these meme tools, video game aesthetics to promote their cause. We have seen so-called siege Nazis, or often jokingly referred to as siege cards. These are very extremist Nazi groups online associated with Telegram, or as they call it, Terrorgram, who organize and perpetuate violent ideas through memes and videos. And they are inspirations for acts of violence and terrorism, which again go viral and become memes themselves. And we saw this very well also especially in the US election in 2016, which was referred to as a meme war. They memed Trump into the presidency. And now we see it in Ukraine. So we've seen the kind of the meme war, as they refer to it. And again, we see different ways of understanding memes when we talk about memetic warfare. The original understanding is more closer to the Dawkins understanding of broad ideas being disseminated to the populace. This is the idea that spread around the early 2000s, at least one book in 2005, discussing how the US military should establish a memetic war command. Right? They should have an organization that produces memetic strategies, how to influence people through psychological warfare, through information warfare online, especially. And then you jump ahead to 2015. There's an interesting paper by Johanne, I don't know how to pronounce his name, who suggests trolling ISIS. And this is an interesting paper in many ways. It is published in a peer-reviewed NATO journal, and he suggests that we should go ahead and troll ISIS, to disrupt ISIS with honeypots, that using women who try to seduce them, but also create hashtags, gay ISIS, and try to make them uncomfortable online by setting them, juxtaposing them with homosexual culture. These are all very interesting ideas, and they originate from a discussion with Charles Johnson, a well-known internet troll. And both him and the author of this paper were among the people who helped usher in Trump's election in 2016, proving his own point that this is an effective way of conducting warfare and election strategies. So what now? Right? So here we have an understanding that memetic warfare and memes can be both kind of these broad ideas, but it also can be trolling, jokes, and kind of this hilarious activity among people. We see it as both kind of a propagandic tool that can be used by governments and institutions, but also something people just do. This is our natural behavior. We will tell jokes. We will have fun, no matter the dire circumstances. So what now? And that is what I hope we can come to through this panel to discuss how is this occurring in Ukraine right now. And I would just like to pass the baton over to Johanne to enlighten us on that.
Thank you, Kristian. So I think I should also have a slide. Yes. I wanted to give you a little bit of background on the Russian internet and the Russian memosphere, because Russia has a tradition of a very vibrant and highly politicized digital culture. And in the first decade of the 2000s, the Russian internet kind of functioned as an alternative public sphere, which very much went under the radar of kind of an aging elite who thought about propaganda in these Soviet terms of top-down influence efforts and traditional legacy media. So even as the traditional mediascape of Russia was increasingly put under the regime's control, the internet kind of remained a free space in many ways, an unrestricted space for political participation and resistance, as we've been talking about, and also very much for creative expression. And the dominant discourse in this space was one of protest. And protest was also the main driver for memetic creation. So here you can see a very old meme, especially in internet terms, a meme from 2008, which is obviously ancient. The Putin crab, which was kind of mocking an interview the president gave where he compared his work as a president to the work of a slave at sea rowing at the galleys. And researchers on Russian new media have found that there is a very high degree of correlation between offline protest activity and memes online, the creation of memes online. So memes have been a very important mechanism for political mobilization in Russia. But more recently, of course, this strong tradition of kind of meme-driven political participation has been encroached on and even weaponized by the state. And a very important moment in this regard, which you also can see here in the slide, were the winter protests about a decade ago 2011, 2012, which were the biggest public uprisings since the fall of the Soviet Union, and also up until then, the biggest trigger for memetic creativity on the Russian internet. And during this event, it was very much the freedom of social networks that enabled people to plan and participate in and mobilize these unprecedentedly huge protests in new ways. And so this was a very rude awakening to the regime, which had focused a lot of their propagandist power on these traditional media channels. So the authorities and their allies decided that, okay, we need to do something, and they launched a series of initiatives to try to kind of gain control of the internet, but also use it to their advantage. So one of these initiatives was what we might call lawfare. So we have something called the Digital Sovereignty Law in Russia, where the Russian authorities were given extremely broad mandates to monitor and control and even isolate the Russian internet. Of course, expressed through a meme here, we see Putin kind of sawing himself off from the global internet, and in the process, bringing himself to destruction. But then, of course, because social media cannot be overtaken in the same way that traditional media can, precisely because it is so participatory in nature, another strategy was to create this massive manipulation complex, which was trying to manipulate public debates and manipulate online communication on its own terms by using the languages and the strategies that had been so powerful and successful for the protests movement, such as humorous memes, for instance. So this is, of course, the era when we saw the birth of the notorious troll factories. And I think it's important also to note here that we mainly associate this kind of Russian manipulation, digital manipulation industry with efforts to interfere in our democratic processes. But the fact is that the brunt of these influence efforts are targeting the Russian language information domain, which covers sort of all the post-Soviet space, including Ukraine and also beyond. And the main focus of this manipulation complex since the invasion precisely of Ukraine, the first invasion in 2014, has been to justify and even glorify Russian aggression against its neighbors, undermine Ukraine as a sovereign state, and perhaps most importantly, to mobilize ordinary, quote unquote, Russian citizens or Russian speakers to participate in this digitally mediated war on Ukraine. So I think it's important to remember that this memetic warfare on Ukraine did not start last year. It has been going on at least since 2014. And it also builds on this very rich meme tradition going back at least another decade in Russia. And so this meme-driven participatory information war on Ukraine, it has a very abundant repertoire of content, which was already existing long before last year. It has a well-oiled machinery for creating new memes, and not least does it have an enormous network of meme warriors with various levels of connection to the state. And I wanted to zoom in on one such warrior network, Cyberfront Z. This group refers to itself as Russia's informational forces and a people's movement appealing to Russians who, quote unquote, care about their country to join the ranks and volunteer to fight on the informational battlefield. And this group also offers paid positions. A Russian journalist went undercover and documented kind of the realities of this group, where people work in 100-people shifts, and they have this quota they have to meet every day, posting 200 posts. And this is obviously very similar to these troll factories that were exposed already years ago. And Cyberfront Z has also been linked to these troll factories and to the person thought to be behind them, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is also, as many know, the founder and head of the Wagner Group. But Cyberfront Z still maintains that it is a popular movement. They rely on mobilizing the grassroots of Russian internet users, and they certainly do, but the ties to Prigozhin, I think, illustrates very well that these kind of volunteer-esque, guerrilla-like online influence efforts are very much valued in Russia's strategy of hybrid warfare. And here memes are very important weapons. So Cyberfront Z, they share what they call combat memes in their social media. And they appeal to followers to continue to deploy these memes online. And the memes themselves are kind of crowdsourced and collected throughout all of the Russian language internet. And one of the suppliers to this meme arsenal is actually the Ministry of Defense itself in Russia, which has created their own kind of online platform for what they call patriotic propagandist content. So what are the actual traits of these combat memes? What we see is a lot of dehumanization. So Ukrainians are frequently represented as pigs, as you might be able to see here. And the exodus of refugees is kind of memified as rats fleeing a sinking ship. There's also a lot of mockery of national symbols. You can see here the Ukrainian coat of arms having been transformed into a pig snout. And then, of course, we have Zelensky as kind of the primary target of mockery. He's variously portrayed as a slave to Western leaders, a flamboyant homosexual, or even pedophile, or in line with this theme of dehumanization, as an insect. We also see a lot of recycling, which of course is very in line with the theme of the meme, recycling of propagandist imagery from World War II, which also, of course, represents an obvious link to the Russian official narrative about having to denazify Ukraine. We also see Russian violence and even the taking of lives being used as a source of amusement. So you could have images of mass graves captioned, "The most important thing is not to win, it's to participate," or images of minced pork photoshopped onto a map of Bakhmut. We see a lot of sexualized memes with Russian soldiers having relations with Ukrainian women with various levels of consent, which is especially concerning given the use of sexual violence and rape in this war. And then finally, we see kind of an intersection between anti-Ukrainian memes and anti-Western memes, showing very much that this memetic warfare goes beyond the Russian-Ukrainian context, which of course also harmonizes very well with this Russian official narrative, right, of Ukraine being weaponized by NATO as a strategy to contain Russia. Yeah.
Thank you. Emma.
Yeah, so I focus on a pro-Ukrainian example of memetic warfare that Liliana has already mentioned, the North Atlantic Peller Organization. And I will address who is NAFO, where is NAFO, what does NAFO do, and finally, what kind of narrative does NAFO memes convey? So NAFO emerged in May last year on Twitter with the initial post of this NAFO logo. And as you see, the NAFO logo looks quite alike the NATO logo, except for the F replacing the T and this dot in the lower left corner. And what characterizes NAFO first and foremost is that it's a collaborative project. Indeed, there is this official account, but that does not produce many of the memes. But instead, everyone can use the NAFO hashtag, and so it gained momentum through the unpredictable and uncontrollable participation of Twitter users. So this begs the question, how can such an unpredictable movement advance the war strategy. And the disadvantage of this social media quality of unpredictability and uncontrollability is that such a movement can vanish as quickly as it appeared, or even worse, could be undermined by trolls from the opposing side. However, NAFO fellows appreciate actually this fact that they are disorganized and unpredictable. And what's more is that such social media phenomena are not fully incalculable because they are structured by the algorithmic and metadata logics of the respective platform, and also by overarching communication logics. So therefore, the agency of social media phenomena exceeds the actions of individual users, because they're also shaped, just as in the offline world, by the social context, as you could call it. As a further characteristic, NAFO is a transnational movement, which you can guess from the national flags that the NAFO fellows attach to their tweets. And then NAFO obviously identifies with NATO, and this includes that NAFO fellows stand for the democratic values that they associate with NATO. Yet the self-understanding that comes across in tweets is that NAFO is a complement or even kind of the better NATO. Because with the slogan, NAFO expansion is non-negotiable, NAFO proclaims that it's a more inclusive alliance than NATO that explicitly includes Ukraine. So thereby, NAFO also criticizes that NATO has not offered Ukraine a concrete membership prospect. And by the way, the tweet there on the left is by Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, who obviously endorsed NATO. At the same time, NATO appears as a welcome complement from the perspective of NATO as well. And I come back to Jeff Gizea, who Kristian already mentioned, who in 2016 urged NATO that it's now time to embrace memetic warfare. And he defined memetic warfare as the competition over narrative, ideas, and social control in a social media battlefield. Accordingly, he classifies memetic warfare as a guerrilla version of psychological warfare, more commonly known as propaganda. And despite his enthusiasm, he acknowledges the legal, moral, and bureaucratic problems that NATO member states face when they want to invest in a type of activity that, as he writes, flourishes with greater autonomy and less oversight. Now, where is NAFO? NAFO originated on Twitter, but has moved into other virtual spaces and also in the offline world. For instance, TVP World, which is the international news channel of Telewizja Polska, reported at length about NAFO in July last year. Then this January, NAFO launched its own website. NAFO posters are also held up at street protests in different cities, and the NAFO even recruits fellows offline. Now, what does NAFO do? The tweet on the left captures quite succinctly what NAFO is up to. The objective is to win the info war through memes and satire directed against Russian trolls. And in NAFO lingua, this practice is called bonking butniks and entails whenever NAFO fellows spot a Russian official or sympathizer posting a program intake on Twitter, they bombard these accounts with support for Ukraine. For instance, they use the hashtag Article 5, which refers to the part of the NATO treaty that calls for the collective defense. And in addition, they flood Twitter with memes and videos that mock Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin's war effort, which I think mirrors very much the idea of competing over narrative in a social media battlefield. But NAFO's activities are not limited to psychological warfare, but NAFO also supports Ukraine's war effort through fundraising. And as the new website explains, what you see here, you become a NAFO fellow, like Liliia, and earn such a personalized avatar if you donate to a charity that supports the Ukrainian defense effort or make a purchase from a store that directs its profits to Ukraine. Conveniently, the website offers a merchandise shop and presents a list of charities and organizations to donate to. And the list includes, for instance, the Georgian Legion, which is a voluntary unit that fights on the side of Ukraine since 2014. Finally, let's look at the narrative that NAFO's visual textual practices convey. So indicative of its self-understanding is that NAFO adopted this Donge meme, and the Donge meme originally spread in 2013 and became so popular that it was even used as the eponym for a new cryptocurrency that Elon Musk promoted. And the Donge meme is modeled after the Japanese dog breed Shiba Inu, which you can see in full splendor in this Nirvana cover meme. And the dog's character actually presents a very suitable identification figure for a guerrilla force fighting an invader. According to a pet magazine, the Shiba Inu has its own mind and does not want to be subordinated. Furthermore, it shows a strong territorial behavior and is distrustful towards strangers. On top of that, choosing a dog creates the self-representation of the underdog, which has the particular appeal called underdog effect. The apparent disadvantage of one side makes the impression of an unfair competition, which in turn generates sympathy and emotional support. So basically, NAFO's memetic warfare has two targets, the own and the opposing side. And those memes directed at the own side often refer to feelings of fear and anger and emphasize that solidarity can work as a remedy against them. For instance, this Yoda avatar, dressed in Ukraine's national colors, if I'm not mistaken, is supposed to calm the concerns of a new fella by proclaiming that NAFO fellas can end all fear when they stand together. Another way to mobilize and encourage supporters is to spread the confidence of victory. What you see here is the offer of an early bird ticket for the NAFO Summer Beach Party 2023 in Crimea to celebrate Ukraine's victory and independence. So the offer suggests military steadfastness and envisions a near glorious post-war era. So thereby it provides NAFO fellas with a political perspective. And it also takes up the underdog narrative that the side which initially appears as the losing party will eventually emerge victorious. As expectable, NAFO fellas construct the enemy in a very different way. And as mentioned, the term commonly used for the enemy is vatnik. And the vatnik is depicted as a grotesque, battered character wearing a wadded jacket, because literally vatnik means wadded jacket. And during the Soviet era, the wadded jacket used to be worn by the poorer strata of society, and now in its memetic impersonation that you also see in this Nirvana cover parody in the background, this is the vatnik meme, is a pejorative term for Russians who believe the Kremlin's propaganda and agree with the government. Now, while the vatnik memes ridicule the enemy, this post employs a less subtle form of war rhetoric, saying that the enemies are ontologically evil and there's no act against them which is wrong. So overall, the key objective of NATO's memetic warfare is to do to Russian propaganda what successful Ukrainian military operations do to the Russian army, namely to expose the weaknesses of an impressive machinery. So as an example, you see now how NATO reacted to the explosion on the Kerch Bridge in October 2022. So now, to conclude, so the NATO movement supports the Ukrainian war effort as a kind of virtual guerrilla through the discursive effects of its memetic warfare and also through the fundraising for military and medical equipment. So the strategic thrust of memes rises from this specific agency that combines the unpredictable participation of users with the algorithmic and metadata logics of the respective platform. And what I would like to emphasize is that the effects of memetic warfare go beyond the supposedly non-real virtual space because they interlock with real world, kinetic, military violence.
Thank you. I believe we have time for some questions. I don't have the time. Yes? Yeah, we have time for one short question. I believe someone in the audience should go then. Oh, do we have any? Yes?
Hi. First of all, thank you for all the very interesting presentations. I was wondering if memetic warfare is a computation of a narrative, and the question is probably also on which platform, so which location of the internet basically are these narratives or these competitions of a narrative happening, because I imagine that from the Russian side it's probably also a lot on Vkontakte, whereas you mentioned that the Ukrainian meetings were often on like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter maybe. So maybe if you could say a few words about the roles of which platforms they use to spread these memes.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, this memetic warfare is inherently multi-sided, right? Because it is a network endeavor. When it comes to the case of this Cyberfront Z, they explicitly say, go where the enemy is. So for instance, if the enemy being, the Ukrainian or NATO information warriors, if they are on Twitter, go on Twitter. So they use this as an explicit part of their strategy to go where they are, because of course, like you mentioned, there are huge differences in the use of social networks. So for instance, in Russia right now, in order to access Twitter or Facebook, you need to circumvent the censorship system. But especially in the case of Cyberfront Z, they are, this is part of their strategy to kind of attack behind enemy lines.
But I have an impression that it is mostly where they originate, and then they spread to Facebook and also Telegram and Viber and other messaging services. On Twitter there is even an account which is called What's Happening on Ukrainian Twitter. So actually, if you cannot follow a discussion on something, or you don't know what this phrase means, you can go and check there to kind of be in the loop, because it happens to me all the time. Like I cannot get the reference, like where is it coming from? So yeah, so people actually organized to just to allow others to keep up with what's on. And I need to mention that when Biden was in Kiev, I mean, I had to take afternoon off because there was so much happening, and you just have to follow it. So whenever something big is happening, then Twitter is the place to be.
How the dynamic of the social media phenomena. I mean, I think the difference is a bit to the Russian case, where there is some kind of state strategy behind that. There's also a spread beyond the platform where such a movement like the NAFO originated from its own dynamic. So it's not that there's someone kind of having the strategy to go where the enemy is, but that it's the users that, or the people who get to know about this phenomenon, who kind of take it in other spheres, yeah, and so in other virtual spaces, but also, for instance, with NAFO, now, I mean, then at some point they professionalized, so they make their own website, yeah, because it was so successful, obviously. But there must be some people who like kind of take this up. Then I even heard like recently about a computer game that was kind of inspired by NAFO. Then you have like the media reports about the phenomenon, which again kind of reproduce it in a way, yeah, through articles, through like this TV report or whatever, yeah. And then you have the people who like then take it to the streets, who are NAFO fellas, and use this as a symbol in their pro-Ukrainian protests. Or then the picture that I showed, this was actually like an event by the German Party Foundation, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, where they had an event called Café Kiev, and there was a stand of the NAFO where they kind of recruited fellas. And so that's just like how we can imagine that even without someone like kind of a state behind driving this, it's this kind of unpredictable. When it is successful, you cannot determine that it will happen that way, but it can develop such a dynamic.
And if I could add about the physical space, so this is a cup I received as a present from my husband, who is not Ukrainian, but that is a Saint Javelin cap. So you can see here this NAFO kind of fella, this dog, which is portrayed as a saint. You know, this may be too sensitive for some group of people, but of course all the signs, those are like Ukrainian state weapon signs. So this is how NAFO also reaches out to offline world, and by buying this cups, you of course support effort to help Ukraine, withstand the invasion. So.
I don't know. Do we have time for more? Yeah, 10 more minutes.
Oh,
excellent.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Splendid.
Yes.
Splendid. Now I would like to just follow up here, because what is interesting with this panel here is that there are 3 different approaches to memetic warfare and to means. You have the semi-organized kind of more. There is an organization. There is some sort of drive here, but it's not a governmental institution. And then you have the governmental institutions that are driving the meme production and troll factories and all these. And then you have the popular use of these memes. And I'm thinking, just thinking out loud here. Which ones do you find to be more effective in winning the hearts and minds of its audience? Would you dare make a suggestion? Yes?
I think it is very interesting when the authorities are trying to adopt some of these, like you said, very folkloristic grassroots practices. I mentioned the Ministry of Defense in Russia having kind of started their own production of memes. They are awful. They are just not funny at all. They're so pompous and not very popular, let's say that. So I think there is something in when trying to to hone this and professionalize it in a way, which just undermines the whole idea of the meme. So yeah, the notion of memetic warfare might in a way be counterintuitive because the meme is supposed to be, you know, yeah, this cultural driven phenomenon. I'm not sure what you think. Is it possible to do memetic warfare as kind of a strategy from above?
I think that this is an inbuilt dilemma that it's already in like this paper by Jeff Isaiah, or however you pronounce that name, that he suggested as a strategy to NATO member states, but at the same time he acknowledges this, what I mentioned, as kind of several. He says like, okay, we have some bureaucratic problems, like kind of really practically, like which department would do that, and because there could be legal problems because there could be transgressions of memetic warfare, as your examples showed, but also some of mine examples or your examples, they are unethical in kind of how they depict the enemy and all that. But that's kind of part of winning the narrative in a social battlefield. But it could be problematic for kind of government institution to kind of promote this, finance this officially. Yeah. So he says like, okay, actually that's what we should do, but we have some kind of bureaucratic, legal, and practical problems to do that. So I think that's why I wouldn't say like compare the effectiveness. I wouldn't exclude that a government could somehow also do this in an effective way. Yeah. I think when we could even think about examples of propaganda in the past, yeah, not through memes, like the BBC in Germany or whatever, where I think there were also successful attempts, you could say, of like states promoting certain, yeah, cultural ideas. So even though maybe, as you said, like the Russian state is not doesn't have the best meme designers, but I wouldn't say that it's not possible. For instance, I could also mention there is another movement on Twitter, the Ukrainian meme forces, and they the difference to NAFO is that they are more focused really on just producing humorous memes, whereas NAFO is really like kind of also having this fundraising aspect. And not all of the posts with the NAFO hashtag are really funny. Some are also, as the one example that I showed with the enemy is ontological evil, is not so funny maybe anymore. But the Ukrainian meme force, really, they just produce funny memes. But it's a bit more less dynamic because it's a central account that produces the memes. It's not that it's so participatory. No. So I think that I wouldn't want to judge the effectiveness, but I think there are different approaches that can have different purposes.
If I could just add that it's Ukrainian meme forces, they collaborate very successfully with NATO in some operations, if you can call them. But what I also want to highlight that it's not only like people spreading Russian propaganda or bots, you know, even some personalities on Twitter who have a lot of followers and who tweet some like narratives which really fall like in this Kremlin narrative can be kind of attacked. Or so Elon Musk is like primary example. He's of course kind of silently killing Twitter because you see less and less actually memes as you used to see before. But he was, yeah, whenever he posts anything which has to do with Ukraine with very questionable views, then of course the forces are mobilized kind of to show him that we disagree, and that is actually very important that people with real accounts also do that, because a lot of times you hear this, oh, you know, those are also just bots, you know, But actually, like NECFO fellows and also people on Ukrainian Twitter, those are real people behind. So it is very important that those people kind of show their support. And even like our ministers who are, for instance, for digitization, they are very active as well in this sphere. When it comes to persons, in the Western societies who might unwillingly or willingly also spread the narratives which Ukrainians then disagree with.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering about two aspects. One is the role of the private sector, and the other one is the specific attention to target audiences. Because when we talk about success or effectiveness of communication, I mean, this varies a lot based on who is the target audience. And for example, when I was looking at the website, I think the name is Brave to be Ukraine, something like that, that I could immediately recognize because of the language and the images are, like Hollywood style. So I was thinking this is for us. So this is a communication for Western audiences. Whether, for example, in other occasions, something about from Russia was, I think I didn't immediately, I couldn't immediately relate to what was the main message. Probably I was not the main target audience in that case. So, so then it depends a lot. And I was wondering whether you have noticed some specific, strategies in targeting. At the global level, some target audiences. And the other one is related, and then what's the role of the private sector? Because I think, again, in Brave to be Ukraine, there one company probably helped to design the whole website. And I was I was thinking if this is like the rule also in Russia, so private sectors providing expertise on these things.
Yes, anyone would?
I would just make a comment. I don't remember what exactly this website is about, to be honest, because there are different ones. But about the role, I mean, this attack also showed how good Ukrainians are actually at communication to the Western audience, to ourselves. So so I'm not surprised that whatever is being produced looks good, because also our president and his speechwriters were praised for how he's conveying the message. So that's my comment. I honestly don't remember what the Brave Ukrainians is, unfortunately, but maybe you do.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with these specific sites, but I think one obvious thing to look at is, which Liliia also mentioned in the beginning, is what is the language in the text captions, right? That very much tells us who the target audience is. I think you see a lot of different languages happening in this particular memetic war, right? Because it's involving Russia, it's involving Ukraine, it's involving the West as such. There are different, like sometimes you can see the same meme just with a different text in either English or Russian, but often you also see a play on cultural references which are so specific either to Ukraine or to Russia that it would be impossible for a Norwegian to catch, like what is even this thing, right? Like just the thing you mentioned with the ovens. We don't have a lot of gas ovens, so it's like for us it might be a little bit more difficult to catch. So while one obvious signal of who the target audience is might be just the language, these memes also have such they're so layered in terms of symbolism and cultural references and folklore that they are very much specific, yes. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer the question about private sector. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm afraid that I can also not answer that question, but I maybe also just regarding the question on the target audiences. In the case of NECFO, I would say like the international or transnational, it's not only the target audience, but it's like it's produced rather by a transnational, like people from several Western when you would call it, or pro-Ukrainian countries, as I already mentioned, and as I learned from Liliia, maybe it's not even that many Ukrainians anymore, but it's like maybe even predominantly kind of Germans or people from Poland or whatever. So you find everything. And with regard to the targets, I would say, as I also mentioned previously in my talk, is I mean, there are two targets. There's also like kind of the opponent, because there were also kind of some kind of Twitter fights between, there was one kind of prominent Twitter fight between NAFO and a Russian official on Twitter. So, and when we think about what are the kind of the intended effects of this warfare, it is kind of also mocking the enemy and like denigrating the enemy, and so this is also the target. So I would say there are like this kind of two targets on the opposing side, to kind of attack them, to make them feel like expose their weaknesses and mock them, and so like kind of maybe demoralize them, yeah, just like in very conventional propaganda ways, but also then kind of what I demonstrated in the own side, kind of mobilizing the own side and encouraging the own side. By the way, this early bird summer ticket was also from the St. Javelin shop. Yeah, so that's what I can say, but I also cannot say something about the private sector role behind it.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm getting the signal that we are out of time. Thank you so much to all three of you for coming. Thank you for coming here in the audience, and thank you for everyone on Zoom. I don't know how many. But, yeah. Thank you.